The kitchen at Larkwood Hall smelled of onions at midnight, which was not, on its own, remarkable. What was remarkable was the Duke of Larkwood standing in the doorway in his banyan, candle in hand, looking at the onion on the block as though it owed him money. He would deny, later and often, that this was the beginning of anything. He would be wrong, and he would eventually admit it, though it took him the better part of a winter to get there. Nothing about that particular Tuesday went as the Duke of Larkwood had planned, and very little about the season that followed went as he expected either. But we are ahead of ourselves. First, the onions. Julian Fairfax had not smiled. By the household's careful and entirely unofficial count, in 2 years and 1 month. Nobody had set out to keep the tally. It had simply accumulated, the way dust does, or grievances, until Mrs. Pruitt the housekeeper could say with some confidence that the last recorded smile had occurred at the christening of a tenant's son, had lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and had never been repeated in company. Grief, in the Duke of Larkwood, did not announce itself. It filed paperwork, it kept to schedules, it closed a wing of the house the way another man might close a fist, and it had been closing things, quietly and with excellent penmanship, since his wife had died of a lung fever the winter before last. Felicity Bramwell, by contrast, had never in her life performed a laugh for anyone's benefit, which was not the same as saying she rarely laughed. She laughed at rather a lot, chiefly at herself, and always without asking permission first. She had the particular composure of a woman who has already survived her worst afternoon and found the rest of life comparatively easy to bear. Her father had been a vicar with more sermons than income. When he died, both the sermons and the income ended, and Felicity had gone into service with 1 trunk, a recommendation of restrained enthusiasm from her former mistress, and a philosophy she had arrived at somewhere around her 19th birthday, and never abandoned since. When the world sits you in the mud, she liked to say, laugh before it teaches you not to. She had been saying it for 4 years. It had not yet stopped working. We ought to go back 3 weeks, to the September afternoon Felicity arrived at Larkwood Hall, because the story does not properly begin at midnight in a kitchen full of onions. It begins earlier, and more quietly, the way most true beginnings do. She came up the long drive on foot, having paid the coachman to carry her trunk the last mile rather than her person, on the grounds that the trunk did not need the exercise, and she did. Larkwood Hall announced itself in stages, first the gatehouse, unmanned and slightly overgrown, then an avenue of limes that had clearly once been fashionable, and were now simply old, and finally the house itself, grey stone and many windows, exactly half of which had their curtains drawn against a sun that was in fact shining rather agreeably. Felicity looked up at the shuttered half of the house and thought, with the swift unkindness of a stranger's first impression, that it looked like a face with 1 eye closed. She was not wrong. She simply did not yet know why. She was engaged as a scullery maid, the lowest post the house had going, on the strength of a letter that praised her honesty and said nothing whatsoever about her cooking, because there was nothing to say. Mrs. Bunce the cook, a broad, exacting woman who ran her kitchen the way a sea captain runs a ship in weather, looked Felicity over for exactly as long as it took to decide she was neither delicate nor stupid, and set her to peeling that same afternoon. "You'll do, Mrs." Bunce said, which from her was practically an ode. Felicity took it as one. The house, Felicity learned in her first week, with the speed of a woman raised on gossip, disguised as parish news, ran on rules nobody had written down, and everybody obeyed. One did not go into the West Wing. One did not mention the late Duchess at dinner, though one could mention her at any other hour, provided one did it quietly. One did not, under any circumstances, wind the clock in the music room, because nobody had wound it in 2 years, and it had become, by a logic Felicity found faintly ridiculous and entirely understandable, a kind of monument. The house kept its grief the way other houses kept a good clock or a bad roof, as a fact of the architecture, unremarked and load-bearing. The Duke himself she saw twice in her first 3 weeks, both times at a distance, both times moving through his own house, like a man crossing a room he did not wish to be recognised in. He was younger than she had expected a duke to be, 31 by the housemaid's best guess, and carried himself with the particular stiffness of a man who has trained his spine to disagree with his feelings. He did not look unkind. He looked, Felicity thought, like a house with the curtains drawn, present, occupied, unavailable. "Does he never come down to the kitchens?" she asked Mrs. Pruitt one evening, mostly out of curiosity and a little out of the natural nosiness of the newly arrived. "Never," said Mrs. Pruitt, folding a tablecloth with the finality of a woman closing a ledger. Her Grace used to. "He does not." What was she like? Warm, Mrs. Pruitt said, and did not elaborate, and Felicity understood from the way she said it that the word was doing the work of several sentences Mrs. Pruitt did not care to speak aloud. Which brings us at last to the Tuesday in question, 3 weeks into Felicity's service, when Mrs. Bunce went to bed with a head cold and left behind an order for the following day's dinner that required, by Felicity's count, considerably more onions than any dish had ever required in the history of English cookery. She suspected later that Mrs. Bunce, feverish and only half attending, had misread her own recipe and doubled a quantity that ought to have stayed singular. At the time, Felicity simply did as she was told, because that is what new scullery maids do, and sat down alone at 11 o'clock at night, with a mountain of onions and a knife that had seen better decades. By midnight she had cried through 4 onions' worth of the ordinary variety, and was well into the 5th, when something else arrived alongside the fumes. A memory of her father's voice reading the lesson on a Sunday, unbidden and entirely unrelated to onions, the kind of grief that ambushes a person sideways rather than announcing itself at the front door. She put down the knife. She let herself cry properly for perhaps 30 seconds, which was, by her own private rationing, the most she generally allowed herself at any one sitting. Then the kitchen door opened, and the Duke of Larkwood was standing in it with a candle. And neither of them had planned for this at all. He had not slept properly in 2 years. This was not a secret exactly, though it was not discussed. The household had simply adjusted its habits around the fact that His Grace could be found awake at unsociable hours, walking the corridors as though counting them, and had learned not to remark on it. That particular night he had smelled onions and, beneath the onions, the specific and unmistakable sound of a woman crying, and some old instinct in him, one he thought he had retired along with most of his other instincts, got him down 2 flights of stairs before his better judgment caught up. He found a stranger sitting amid a battlefield of onion skins, face wet, eyes red, and entirely unwilling to hide either fact from him. She did not scramble to her feet. She did not perform composure for his benefit, the way every other woman in his household would have, the way his own mother had trained an entire generation of ladies to do. She looked straight at him, unafraid, faintly startled, and waited to see what he would do with the information that she had been crying. It was the first thing he registered, and it undid his opening remark considerably. He had meant to ask what she was doing in his kitchen after midnight. What came out instead was, "Who is crying in my kitchen?" "I believe that would be me, your grace," she said, "though I'd point out it's also your onion." He did not smile. He did, however, set the candle down with a care that suggested he had forgotten he was holding it. "Who hurt you?" he said. It was not a question so much as a summons. "Tell me his name, and I will see it addressed before breakfast." Felicity looked at him. A duke, in a dressing gown, at midnight, prepared apparently to ruin a man's morning on her behalf, and she laughed. It came up out of her before she could stop it, involuntary and entirely without permission. The laugh of a woman who has just watched the world do something too absurd not to enjoy. She pressed the back of her wrist to her mouth, too late. "Forgive me," she said, when she had recovered enough breath to speak. "No one has hurt me. I am crying because of an onion, which is a considerably less flattering explanation, and I understand if your grace would prefer the other one." He stared at her. Somewhere behind him, a dog trotted in on the strength of the onion smell alone, sniffed the air with the gravity of a magistrate reviewing evidence, sneezed once, and sat down pointedly at Felicity's feet, having apparently reached a verdict. "That is my dog," Julian said. "Unnecessarily, he has excellent taste," said Felicity, scratching the dog's ear. "In onions, or in company. I haven't decided which." Julian looked at the door, at the corridor beyond it, at the general fact of being discovered in his own kitchen at midnight in his nightclothes, discussing onions with a maid he did not know, and did the only thing that occurred to him. He crossed the room and turned the key in the door, not to trap her, though it would look that way to anyone who came upon the scene later, and several people eventually would, but because Mrs. Pruitt slept lightly, and had opinions about propriety that he did not currently have the composure to defend against, and because it seemed, in the moment, like the sort of thing a man did when he intended to have a proper conversation rather than a corridor-length one shouted through a half-open door. "You may account for the crying," he said, "and I will account for the onions, and neither of us need explain either to the housekeeper." "That," said Felicity, wiping her face at last with the back of her sleeve, "is the most sensible thing anyone in this house has said to me in 3 weeks. He did not smile. He noted, privately and with some irritation at himself for noting it, that he had wanted to. He did not stay long. In the end, 1/4 of an hour. No more. Most of it spent establishing that she was, in fact, unharmed, employed, and in full possession of her wits, and a smaller portion spent in a silence that neither of them quite knew what to do with. He asked her name. She gave it. He said nothing further about it, which she found, on reflection, rather telling, because most men who asked a maid's name did so in order to use it, and he seemed to be filing hers away instead. The way one files a fact one does not intend to act on, and fully intends to remember. He unlocked the door before he left, with the same brisk economy he had used to lock it, and told her, in the tone of a man issuing an order rather than a kindness, to go to bed and leave the onions until morning. "Mrs. Bunce will want them chopped by 6, Felicity said. "Mrs. Bunce," said Julian, "will have considerably less to say about it than she thinks she will," which turned out to be true, since the following morning half the onions had mysteriously chopped themselves. The footman Thomas had been quietly ordered to finish the job before dawn, though nobody told Felicity this for a fortnight, and by then it had become one more small kindness she filed without being able to name its source. Julian walked back up to his rooms telling himself, with the particular firmness of a man building a wall faster than the evidence can knock it down, that nothing of consequence had occurred. A maid had cried over an onion. He had behaved as any reasonable master would behave upon discovering a servant in distress. That she had laughed at him, laughed at a duke, in his own kitchen, at midnight, was an impertinence he ought by rights to be irritated by, and he informed himself several times, quite sternly, that he was. He did not sleep any better that night than any other. He noticed, however, that for once the wakefulness did not feel entirely like grief. It felt, instead, faintly like curiosity, which was a sensation he had not catalogued in some time, and did not at first recognise. He told himself this meant nothing at all. The house, had it been asked, would have disagreed, though the house, being a house, kept its own counsel, and simply waited to see what he would do next. What he did next, it turned out, was invent a reason to return to the kitchens within 4 days, on the grounds that the pantry latch was loose and required a duke's personal inspection, a claim so transparently false that Mr. Perrin the butler did not trouble to hide his expression, which for Mr. Perrin meant one eyebrow rose by a distance he would later, privately, estimate at 2 millimetres and hold to be a household record. "The latch, your grace," Mr. Perrin said, holding the door for him, "has been loose since the spring, and your grace has not once inspected it." "Then it is well past time," said Julian, and went in anyway, and Mr. Perrin's other eyebrow did not rise, because one was, in Mr. Perrin's long experience, quite sufficient commentary for any occasion. The latch, inspected, proved to be exactly as loose as it had been since the spring. Julian stood in front of it for a full minute, working the mechanism with a diligence that convinced absolutely no one, while Felicity, at the far table, went on with the household accounts she had been set to check, and did not look up, which he found, against his will, more interesting than if she had. "You may as well ask," she said, without turning, rather than stand there dismantling my larder's furniture. "Ask what? Whatever brought you down here. It was not the latch. The latch is fine. It has been fine since March, according to the housekeeper's book, and I have read the housekeeper's book. Because I have been reading a great many of your books this week, your grace, and finding them in considerable disorder. Disorder, your supplier of candles has been charging you for beeswax and delivering tallow for the better part of a year," she said, holding up a ledger with the mild satisfaction of a woman producing evidence she had been saving for the right audience. I compared the invoices against the delivery notes. The hand doesn't match on 11 of them, which means somebody along the chain is either careless or dishonest, and I would wager on the second, because careless men rarely round their numbers quite so conveniently. Julian crossed the kitchen and looked over her shoulder at the columns, close enough that he could smell wood smoke and yeast on her apron, and had to remind himself, briefly, what he had come down to say. The figures were exactly as she described. He had not looked at that ledger in 2 years, household accounts, like most things requiring his attention, and offering none of his grief in return, had been quietly handed off to stewards who managed them with varying degrees of competence and no oversight whatsoever. "You read invoices for entertainment," he said. "I read invoices because Mrs. Bunce asked me to check whether we were being cheated, and it turns out we are, and I find that considerably more entertaining than the alternative." She looked up at him then, direct as she had been in the kitchen at midnight, and he registered, with the same faint irritation as before, that he had wanted her to look up sooner than she had. "Was there something else, your grace? Or shall I return to embarrassing your candle merchant?" "Continue," he said, and left, and stood in the corridor outside for slightly longer than the errand warranted, examining an expression on his own face that he could not, from the inside, properly identify. Mr. Perrin, passing with a tray, saw it and said nothing, which for Mr. Perrin constituted the loudest possible remark. He returned 3 days later on the pretext of the account books generally, and again the week after on the pretext of a leak in the scullery roof that had in fact been repaired in July, and by the fourth transparently invented errand even Mrs. Pruitt had stopped pretending to believe him, though she extended him the courtesy of not saying so aloud, on the grounds that a household ought to allow its master at least the dignity of his own delusions. It was on the fourth visit that Mrs. Bunce, watching him hover near the account table, with a candle in his hand, and no apparent purpose for it, caught Felicity's eye across the kitchen, and lifted one significant brow, a gesture Felicity chose, wisely, not to interpret aloud. The almost smile arrived that same afternoon, and very nearly escaped without being noticed, which was precisely its habit. Felicity had said something about the candle merchant's handwriting resembling a drunk spider, and Julian's mouth had moved, not far, not for long, the barest tightening at one corner that lasted, by Mr. Perrin's later and entirely unofficial reckoning from the doorway, somewhere under 2 seconds, before it caught itself and returned to its usual discipline. Was that a smile? Your Grace, Felicity asked, because she had noticed, and because she had decided early on, that she was not the sort of woman who pretended not to notice things. It was a facial adjustment, Julian said, unrelated to amusement. Of course, said Felicity, I shall log it as such. She did not, in fact, keep a written log. Mrs. Pruitt, however, did, in the sense that she mentioned the incident to Mr. Perrin over the evening's last pot of tea, and Mr. Perrin mentioned it to nobody, because he did not need to. His eyelid did the mentioning for him, twitching once, gravely, like a man raising a small and dignified flag. It was around this time that Felicity found the tin. She had been sent to clear out a shelf at the back of the dry larder that nobody had touched in some years, judging by the dust, and among the flour tins and the spice boxes she found a small battered box with a hinged lid, and inside it a stack of recipe cards in a hand she did not recognise, brown ink faded to the colour of weak tea, each card noting not only ingredients but small marginal opinions, more nutmeg than this, add the plums a day early if the weather's warm. His Grace prefers the crust darker than I do. She showed the tin to Mrs. Bunce, expecting perhaps mild interest. Mrs. Bunce went very still. That was her Grace's, she said. The old Duchess, I mean. Not the current one. There isn't a current one. I mean the Duchess who died. She took the tin gently, as though it might object to handling, and set it on the table without opening it further. She used to come down here herself, sleeves rolled, flour to the elbow, and bake alongside me on a Sunday. Nobody's touched that tin since. I couldn't. Wouldn't have known where to put it that wasn't in the way of something. Should I put it back? Felicity asked. Mrs. Bunce looked at the tin for a long moment, and then at Felicity, and something in her broad, tired face shifted, the way weather shifts before it decides which way to break. No, she said finally. I think perhaps you oughtn't. Felicity did not, at first, understand the weight of what she had been handed. She understood it a little more each day that followed, as she learned, from Mrs. Pruitt in careful fragments, from the maids in gossip Felicity took with the appropriate grain of salt, from the closed door of the west wing that nobody entered and nobody explained. That the house she worked in had a shape carved out of it, room by room. the exact size and outline of a woman who was no longer in it. The west wing had been Eleanor's. It had been closed the week after the funeral, and had stayed closed since, the furniture under sheets, the windows shuttered, as though grief were a draught one could keep out with enough diligence. The rose garden beyond the orangery, which Eleanor had planted herself, and tended with an enthusiasm the gardeners still spoke of fondly, had been left to itself for 2 years, and had gone in that time from garden to thicket, roses fighting weeds for the same 6 feet of soil and mostly losing. The pianoforte in the music room had not been played since the last evening Eleanor sat at it. The clock beside it had stopped the same week, and nobody had wound it, out of a superstition nobody would admit to holding. "He isn't cold, Mrs.," Pruitt said one evening, when Felicity asked, carefully, why a man who inspected latches with such devotion could not bring himself to open a door. "He's careful. There's a difference, though it doesn't always look like one from the outside. He decided, I think, that if he kept everything exactly as it was, the missing her would stay exactly the same size too, and not grow to fill up the whole house. It hasn't worked, of course. Grief doesn't hold still just because you ask it nicely. But he's been asking it nicely for 2 years, and I haven't the heart to tell him it's rude not to answer." Felicity thought about her own father's study, which she had not been able to enter for a month after his death, and about the particular grief of a girl who had lost a parent, and then, in short order, a home, a income, and most of the people who had once called her by her Christian name. "I lost my father 4 years ago," she told Mrs. Pruitt, not because it was asked of her, but because it seemed, suddenly, worth saying aloud. "I thought for a while that laughing at anything, ever again, would be a kind of disloyalty to him. Then I decided the opposite was true, that laughing was the thing he'd have wanted from me, and refusing to do it was letting whatever took him take that too. I don't know if His Grace has had anybody tell him that laughing again isn't betrayal. It rather sounds as though nobody has." Mrs. Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said. "I don't believe anybody has. The ritual, when it began, did not announce itself as a ritual. It simply accumulated, the way most true habits do, out of small repeated accidents that neither party examined too closely, for fear of what they would find. Julian discovered that the kitchen produced bread at 4 o'clock on Thursdays, because Felicity had taken to baking from the old tin on her single free afternoon, and he discovered, at almost exactly the same time, that 4 o'clock on Thursdays was an excellent hour to review the household accounts, which required him to be in the kitchen, which required him to be there roughly around the time the bread came out. He told himself the accounts genuinely needed reviewing. The accounts, it should be said, did need reviewing, and were considerably improved for it. He did not examine the coincidence of the hour at any great length, on the grounds that some coincidences are more comfortable left unexamined, and a man recovering slowly from 2 years of careful stillness is entitled to a few comfortable delusions on his way back to the world. By the middle of November it had simply become true that he came down on Thursdays, and neither of them declared it, and the household, watching, declared it thoroughly enough on their behalf that even the second footman had an opinion, though nobody asked him for it. The rain that trapped them together arrived on the last Thursday of November, sudden and enormous, the kind of downpour that turns an afternoon errand into an overnight decision, and it caught Julian in the kitchen garden fetching herbs he did not strictly need, and Felicity at the kitchen door calling him in before he drowned, attempting to look dignified about it. They ended up sitting at the long table, with the rain going sideways against the windows and nowhere sensible for either of them to be, until it passed. And it was there. with tea going cold between them and the fire doing most of the talking, that the conversation turned honest in a way it had not, until then, quite dared to. "The tin," Julian said, nodding at it on the shelf, where it now lived openly rather than in exile. "You know whose it was." "Mrs." Bunce told me. "I'm sorry. I ought to have asked before I used it." "No." He said it quickly enough that it surprised them both. "No, I'm glad someone finally did. It sat there for 2 years being nobody's business, which is a poor way to treat a good recipe." He turned his cup a quarter turn on its saucer, a small, precise gesture she was beginning to recognise as the thing he did instead of speaking, when speaking was difficult. "Her name was Eleanor. She would have liked you, I think, though she would also have found you a nuisance in the kitchen, since she liked to be the only one making a mess of it." "What was she like?" Felicity asked, and then, before he could deflect it into politeness, added, not the version people give visitors, "the real one." He was quiet long enough that she thought she had overreached. Then he said, "She laughed at things she wasn't meant to laugh at. Sermons, funerals once, which caused a scandal that took a full season to die down. She said grief was easier to bear if you didn't take it quite so seriously, which I thought at the time was the most foolish thing I had ever heard a sensible woman say." He looked at the fire rather than at Felicity. "I have had 2 years to discover she was entirely correct, and I have made very little practical use of the discovery until, apparently, recently, you don't have to stop being careful with her memory," Felicity said, "in order to start being warm again." "I don't think those cancel each other out. I think you've been treating them as though they do. That is," he said, after a silence long enough to count, very close to something she would have said to me. "I shall take that as a compliment and not an accusation of theft." It was not an accusation. He looked at her properly then, and something in his face, not a smile, not quite, but its close and patient cousin, held for slightly longer than his usual 2 seconds before it retreated. Miss Perrin, who happened to be passing the corridor window at that exact moment on an errand that could easily have waited, would later log it privately as the first genuine one, dated the last Thursday of November, and would mention it to nobody but his own eyelid, which twitched with what could only be described as satisfaction. "Keep using the tin," Julian said, standing, the rain easing at last outside, as though it had only ever been waiting for that sentence to be spoken. "I find I don't mind the house smelling of bread again. I had forgotten I minded its absence until it stopped being absent." "I'll keep using the tin," Felicity said, "on the condition that your Grace stops inventing errands and simply admits he likes the bread." "I admit nothing," said Julian, and left, and admitted, entirely to himself and nobody else, that he had. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in the 2nd week of December, delivered by a solicitor's clerk who had ridden 2 days in weather no sensible man would have chosen, which ought to have told the household something about the letter's importance before anyone had read a word of it. It concerned a contract drawn up 11 years earlier by Julian's father and a neighbouring landowner named Whitcomb, providing, in the dry legal language such documents favour, for the eventual marriage of the 2 families' children, one Julian Fairfax and one Honora Whitcomb, then aged 14 and 11 respectively, and consulted about the arrangement not at all. The contract had been quietly shelved when both fathers discovered their children showed no enthusiasm whatsoever for the plan, and considerably more for avoiding each other at assemblies, and it had lain forgotten in a strong-box for the better part of a decade, until old Mr. Whitcomb's death that autumn prompted his solicitor to comb through his papers and discover. with the particular joylessness of a man doing his job thoroughly, that the contract had never been formally voided. "It is not enforceable," Julian said, reading it a second time at his desk, while his cousin Rutherford Vane, who had arrived for the reading with a promptness that suggested he had been informed of the letter's contents before Julian himself, hovered near the window with an expression of manufactured concern. "It says so in the 3rd clause. Either party may withdraw upon reaching majority without penalty. I reached majority a decade ago." Of course," Rutherford said, in the tone of a man agreeing so readily that the agreement itself became suspicious. Though one imagines the Whitcombes might raise the question publicly, given the timing, and public questions of that nature have a way of becoming inconvenient for a man who has recently taken an interest in a certain member of his own kitchen staff. He said the last part lightly, as though remarking on weather, and Julian's jaw set in a way Rutherford, who had spent considerable effort cultivating an interest in his cousin's continued bachelorhood, chose not to notice. Rutherford Vane stood one step from the title should Julian die without issue, a fact he had never stated aloud and never once stopped calculating, and the prospect of his cousin marrying anyone at all, let alone a scullery maid with no fortune and considerable charm, was not one he intended to encourage without a fight fought entirely through other people's mouths. He was not, it should be said, a cruel man, only an anxious one dressed up as a concerned one, and his scheme, such as it was, amounted to little more than reminding Julian at every opportunity that a duke had obligations, that the Whitcombes were a respectable family, and that gossip, once loosed, rarely returned quietly to its kennel. Julian, for his part, said nothing to Felicity about the letter for 4 days, which she noticed, and did not ask about, and filed away with the same wary attention she gave any silence in that house that had not existed the week before. What she did not know, and would not learn for some weeks, was that in the same week the letter arrived. Julian had also quietly instructed his steward to renew, at the estate's expense and without any renter's request, the lease on a small cottage 2 villages over, the cottage in which Felicity's widowed mother had been struggling, unbeknownst to her daughter, to meet a rent that had crept upward twice in 3 years. Julian had learned of the arrears from an offhand remark of Felicity's, made weeks before, and apparently forgotten by everyone but him, and had settled the matter through his solicitor with the same brisk anonymity he applied to correcting a faulty invoice, telling no one, least of all Felicity, because it had not occurred to him that a kindness required an audience to be complete. The house, meanwhile, prepared for the arrival of the one person in the family capable of making even a duke sit up straighter, the Dowager Duchess Cordelia, Julian's grandmother, who wintered at the Dower House 2 miles off, and had, upon hearing rumours of a maid and a Thursday habit, and a tin of recipe cards suddenly returned to use, announced her intention to come and see for herself precisely what her grandson thought he was doing with his one remaining household. She arrived on a Thursday, deliberately, in a carriage exactly on time, which everyone in the household understood to be its own kind of warning. The Dowager Duchess Cordelia was 71 years old, 5 feet nothing in her thickest slippers, and possessed of a gaze that had, by reliable family legend, once caused a bishop to reconsider a sermon mid-delivery. She took tea in the drawing-room with a correctness that made the room itself seem to sit up straighter, asked after Julian's health in a tone that made clear she already knew the answer and disapproved of it, and then, with no transition whatsoever, informed him that she wished to speak with the kitchen maid, alone, she added, before he could offer to remain. Felicity was sent for. She came up from the kitchen with flour still faintly ghosting one wrist and no time to change, which the Dowager Duchess noted, and approved of rather more than she let show. "Sit," said the Dowager Duchess, and Felicity sat, and for a long moment the old woman simply looked at her, the way one examines a piece of furniture for the quality of its joinery. "You are the one baking from Eleanor's tin." "Yes, ma'am." "Do you know how many women in this house have touched that tin in 2 years? I understand. I am the first." "You are the first who thought to ask whether she was allowed rather than assuming she wasn't," the Dowager Duchess said. "That is not nothing. Most people, faced with a locked door, either force it or avoid it entirely. Few think to knock." She set down her cup with a precision that suggested every gesture she made had been considered in advance. "Tell me your intentions toward my grandson, and tell me honestly, because I have buried a husband, a son, and a granddaughter-in-law I loved very much, and I have very little patience remaining for a young woman who does not know her own mind." Felicity did not flinch, which the Dowager Duchess also noted. "I don't know that I have intentions, ma'am, in the sense you mean. I didn't come here to catch a duke. I came here because I needed work, and this house needed a scullery maid. What's happened since is that I've come to think a great deal of him, more than I planned to, and more, I suspect, than is entirely wise given the distance between a maid and a duke. And I haven't the first idea what to do about that, except to keep being honest with him, and let him decide what it's worth. And if I told you it was worth nothing, that a duke does not marry a vicar's orphaned daughter with no fortune, whatever affection he might feel in a kitchen on a rainy Thursday, then I'd say you were probably right about the difficulty of it, ma'am, and wrong about whether that changes anything I've just told you. I'm not offering to stop caring for him because it's inconvenient. I don't think caring works that way, in my experience, and I've had enough experience of losing people to know that pretending not to care doesn't spare you the losing. It only spares you the caring in between, which seems a poor trade. The Dowager Duchess Cordelia was quiet for a long moment, studying her, and when she finally spoke her voice had lost some of its edge, though none of its precision. "My granddaughter-in-law used to say something very like that," she said, "that the alternative to grief was not safety. It was simply an earlier, quieter kind of loss, the kind you choose for yourself so the real one can't surprise you." She looked toward the window, toward the grey garden beyond it, and for a moment the formidable old woman looked simply old, and tired, and fond. I have watched my grandson practice that quieter loss for 2 years, and I confess I had begun to think he preferred it. You are the first thing to walk into this house that made me wonder whether he didn't. She stood, gathering her shawl with the air of a woman closing a meeting she had in fact already decided the outcome of before it began. "I will tell you what I told his father once, about a girl he was too proud to admit he loved. Certainty is not a prerequisite for planting. You put the seed in without knowing the summer. That is not foolishness. That is simply how gardens are made." She paused at the door. "You have my blessing, for what an old woman's blessing is worth against a solicitor's letter. I should think it is worth rather more, in the end, though solicitors rarely agree with me." The solicitor's letter, as it happened, resolved itself with considerably less drama than Rutherford Vane had hoped for. A second letter arrived within the week, this one from the Whitcomb family solicitor rather than the estate of the elder Mr. Whitcomb, containing a brief and businesslike note from Honora Whitcomb herself, now 24 and by her own cheerful account, entirely uninterested in marrying a duke she had last spoken to at the age of 11, and remembered chiefly for stepping on her foot at a country dance. She had, she wrote, recently accepted an offer from a naval captain of her own choosing, and wished the contract voided at the earliest convenience, with her compliments and no hard feelings whatsoever. Julian's own solicitor confirmed within the day that the third clause made the whole business moot regardless. Rutherford Vane, informed of both facts within the same afternoon, expressed relief on his cousin's behalf with a warmth so sudden and complete that even Mr. Perrin's eyelid found it difficult to keep a straight face. The obstacle, such as it had been, dissolved into paperwork exactly as such obstacles do in a house of this kind, leaving behind only the small residue of a countdown Julian had, without quite meaning to, been keeping since the letter first arrived, a private and increasingly urgent sense that a thing worth saying ought to be said before some other letter. Some other cousin. Some other accident of timing arrived to complicate it further. He did not say it immediately. He was, whatever his other virtues, a man whose eloquence had a habit of failing him at precisely the moments he needed it most, and he spent the better part of a week composing sentences in his head that dissolved the instant he stood near enough to deliver them. Felicity, unaware of the extent of his private rehearsal, and considerably more aware than she let on that something had shifted in the house's weather since the Dowager Duchess's visit, threw herself into the kitchen's work with the particular focus of a woman who has decided that whatever happens next will happen in its own time, and that scrubbing the good copper in the meanwhile is not avoidance so much as sense. It was a bright, hard, blue-skied morning in the second week of January, the kind of cold that makes a ride across open country either a very good idea or a very bad one, depending entirely on the urgency of the rider, when Julian, having spent the previous evening failing for the 11th time to compose an adequate sentence, gave up on sentences altogether, saddled his own horse without waiting for a groom, and rode the 3 miles to the market town where Felicity had gone that morning on an errand for Mrs. Bunce, arriving at the inn yard with his hair in open rebellion against every rule it had ever followed, and no plan whatsoever beyond finding her. She was coming out of the chandler's with a parcel of candles under one arm when she saw him, and stopped, because a duke arriving wind-blown and hatless at a market town inn yard is not, by any measure, an ordinary sight, and because something in his face told her this was not about candles, or accounts, or even the weather. "Your Grace," she said, "you've lost your hat." "I've lost considerably more than my hat," Julian said, dismounting with less grace than he generally managed. "And I find I no longer have the patience to compose a proper sentence about it, so I am simply going to say the sentences as they arrive, and you will have to forgive whatever order they come in." "I generally do," said Felicity, setting down her parcel, because something in her had already understood what was coming and wanted both hands free for it. "Because you moved the beehives," he said, "which nobody asked you to do, and which solved a problem I had been ignoring for 2 years, because solving it meant walking past the orangery, and you walked past it without knowing it cost me anything at all. Because the dog prefers your company to mine, and I have entirely stopped resenting him for it. Because the library is unbearable on Tuesdays now, when you are occupied elsewhere in the house, in a way it was never unbearable before you arrived, which is a very poor state of affairs for a library to be in. Because you found a tin nobody had touched in 2 years, and did not ask my permission to use it. You simply asked whether it was allowed, and there is a difference. And I did not know until you showed me that the difference was everything." He stopped, started again, the sentences arriving now in something closer to a rush than a march. Because you cried over an onion the first night I met you, and laughed at me for offering to defend your honour against a vegetable, and I have not stopped thinking about that laugh since, not once. Not for 2 years' worth of habit built specifically to prevent me thinking about anything at all. Because my grandmother, who has not approved of a single thing I have done in a decade, approves of you, and I did not think there existed a person alive capable of achieving that. Because I am making an appalling mess of this proposal, and you are simply standing there letting me, which I understand now is precisely the kind of attention I have wanted for 2 years, and did not know how to ask for. He ran out of breath, or nerve, or both, and finished, more quietly, marry me. I am aware I am doing this very badly, in an inn-yard, without my hat, in front of at least 3 people I can see, and probably several more I cannot. Felicity looked at him for a long moment, the wind, the missing hat, the parcel of candles forgotten at her feet, the whole absurd. Sincere shape of him standing in a market town yard, having apparently abandoned every rehearsed word he owned, and something in her chest, held carefully in check for weeks, out of a caution she had never quite managed to fully believe in, simply let go. "You are doing it exactly right," she said. "Yes, obviously, yes," and then she laughed. Not the small, unperformed thing that had escaped her over an onion 3 months before, but the real, full, unguarded laugh she had been keeping in reserve without knowing it, the one that came up out of her whole body and would not be stopped, and Julian standing in front of her with his hair still in disarray and his sentences finally spent, laughed too. For the first time in 2 years and 1 month, a real laugh, helpless and surprised at itself, that lasted, by Felicity's own later and entirely gleeful count, insisted upon at every retelling for the rest of their lives, 4 full seconds before it dissolved into something that was not quite laughter any more, and was instead considerably better. The betrothal was announced at Larkwood Hall the following week, and the household received the news with a unanimity of joy that startled precisely no one who had been paying attention since November. Mrs. Bunce wept into a bowl of unrisen dough, and declared it would rise anyway out of spite. Mrs. Perrin's eyelid twitched so thoroughly that Mrs. Pruitt asked, not unkindly, whether he required a physician, to which he replied that he did not. He was merely experiencing an emotion, and would thank her to note the date for the household record. The negotiations, such as they were, took place chiefly in the kitchen, over the last of the plum loaf, and consisted almost entirely of terms neither party found remotely difficult to agree upon, and both insisted on stating aloud regardless, on the general theory that a treaty properly ratified ought to be spoken, not merely assumed. "I shall want a proper oven put in," Felicity said, "one that doesn't require Mrs. Bunce to pray to it before it consents to bake evenly. That is non-negotiable." "Granted," said Julian. "I shall want the rose garden reopened by spring, whatever the state of the thicket, and I shall want you in it, since you're the only person in this house who's ever managed to make me walk past it without flinching. Also granted, though I make no promises about my skill with roses. And the tin stays in the kitchen. It isn't a keepsake to be locked away somewhere precious. It's a tin for baking. Eleanor would want it flour-dusted, not framed." "Agreed," Julian said, and then, more quietly, "Thank you for understanding that before I did." "I understand a great many things before you do," said Felicity. "It's rather my chief talent." "It is one of several," he said, and did not elaborate, and Mrs. Bunce, watching from the range, decided that whatever else changed in that house, the bread at least, would go on rising properly, and considered that a fair bargain for a duke's household to have struck. They were married in the village church in the middle of February, in a ceremony so small and so quickly arranged that half the county complained of missing it, and the other half claimed, not entirely truthfully, to have been invited all along. It was a plain service, over almost before the frost on the windows had a chance to notice, and remarkable chiefly for two incidents that the household would recount for years afterward, with steadily increasing embellishment. The dog, Diogenes, who had not been invited and attended anyway by the simple expedient of following Felicity down the aisle with the solemn bearing of a creature who considered himself, on reasonable evidence, one of the match's original architects and entitled to witness its conclusion, and the Dowager Duchess Cordelia, who sat in the front pew with a face of magisterial composure through the entire service and wept, without a trace of shame, the moment the register was signed, on the grounds, she said afterward, that a woman her age had earned the right to cry at whichever moment she pleased, and had chosen this one deliberately. Spring came to Larkwood Hall the way it comes to houses that have been waiting for it, without quite admitting they were waiting. The west wing was opened in April, on a morning bright enough that the dust motes in the unshuttered light looked almost celebratory rather than sad, and the sheets came off the furniture one room at a time, not in a single dramatic sweep, but slowly, the way a person relearns a language they set aside out of grief rather than forgetting. Julian walked through it with Felicity beside him, naming rooms as they went. This was her sitting room. This was where she read. This was where she used to leave her gloves and never once remember where. And found, to his quiet surprise, that speaking Eleanor's name in the rooms she had lived in did not feel like reopening a wound. It felt, rather, like finally letting the wound finish healing in the open air, instead of under a bandage 2 years too tight. The rose garden, cleared of its thicket by May, did not return all at once either. But it returned. Felicity proved, true to her word, no great gardener, and several of the original roses did not survive her enthusiastic and largely theoretical understanding of pruning. But enough came back, coaxed by a gardener who remembered Eleanor's methods better than either of them did, that by June the garden smelled, on a warm evening, the way Mrs. Bunce swore it had smelled a decade before, and the Dowager Duchess, visiting for tea, pronounced it insufficiently disciplined and entirely correct, which the household understood to be the highest praise she was constitutionally capable of offering. The pianoforte was wound and played again in May, not by Felicity, who confessed cheerfully to having no ear whatsoever, but by the Dowager Duchess herself, who arrived one afternoon, sat down at the instrument without announcement, and played a short, simple piece she said Eleanor had once taught her, badly over the course of one very patient winter. The clock beside it was wound the same afternoon, and has kept correct time, more or less, ever since, which the household considers, on balance, a reasonable outcome for any clock in that particular house. Rutherford Vane, informed by letter of the wedding and the general collapse of every anxiety he had spent a decade cultivating, sent a card of congratulations so effusive that Mrs. Pruitt read it aloud in the servants' hall purely for the entertainment value, and was not seen at Larkwood Hall again for the better part of 2 years, a fact nobody found themselves particularly troubled by, and which he would, had anyone asked him, have minded rather less than he once expected to. Honora Whitcomb married her naval captain that same summer, in a ceremony considerably larger and considerably louder than Felicity and Julian's, and sent, along with her own wedding announcement, a short note expressing her sincere hope that the Duke of Larkwood had, in the end, married someone with better sense than to marry for a contract, a hope Felicity found so agreeable that the two women corresponded amicably for years afterward, chiefly on the subject of husbands who meant well, and occasionally required firm correction. By midsummer, the household's unofficial ledger, kept now with rather less solemnity than it once had been, recorded that His Grace smiled most mornings before breakfast, on most days had done so at least twice by noon, and had, on 3 separate and carefully noted occasions, laughed aloud at something Mrs. Bunce said, which she considered, not without justice, the single greatest achievement of her professional career. The tin sat exactly where it had been left, flour-dusted and unframed, its lid slightly warped now from years of use rather than years of disuse, and it produced, most Thursdays, a plum loaf that the whole house had come to regard less as a recipe, and more as a kind of weather, reliable, warm, and no longer remarkable simply for arriving. Diogenes lived to a great and dignified age, attended every subsequent family christening with the same unearned solemnity he had brought to the wedding, and never once, in all his years, developed any opinion of onions beyond the firm and consistent conviction that they were beneath him. There are stories that begin with a woman crying in a kitchen at midnight over something that turns out, on inspection, to be nothing at all, and there are houses that spend 2 years with half their curtains drawn against a sun that never once stopped shining outside them. This was both of those stories, and it ended, as such stories tend to, not with the curtains torn down all at once, but with someone walking room by room, opening them one old latch at a time, until the whole house stood in the light again, and could not quite remember, on the brightest mornings, why it had ever thought the dark was safer.